So today we have the privilege of having a co-presentation by Janet Warren and Subhas Ganguli, who are going to talk to us about, a topic to do with health and the benefits of a plant-based diet, both from a sort of a research perspective, but also from a theological perspective. So Janet is a family physician, and she has a PhD in theology, and Subhas is a gastroenterologist. Yeah, that's it, right? Here in Hamilton. It's going to be a really neat mixture of two. And they're going to talk about the Daniel diet and sort of biblical and scientific perspectives on nutrition. So I think this will be really exciting and really important for us. So I'll hand over to you, Janet.
Thanks. So first of all, in terms of our disclosures, I have no conflict of interest, and Dr. Ganguli does teach a course on a plant-based diet. And I know it will seem obvious, but necessary to say this talk does not constitute medical advice. If you have any personal problems, you need to see your own physician. Okay, so as we all know, food, or more importantly, nutrition, is essential for life. It also gives us much enjoyment. And food is also a central biblical concept. However, as we all know from the news and friends and neighbors, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic diseases, which are partly related to poor dietary choices, are prevalent globally. We're going to be focusing on North America. And there's multiple factors: aging population, decline in mental health, socioeconomic factors, but all of these impact quality of life. In addition, there's been a lot of changes in dietary patterns in the last few decades, a lot more eating away from home, increased consumption of processed and refined foods, sugar and fat. The so-called SAD, or Standard American Diet, has been found to be nutritionally deficient. Interestingly, a 2006 study showed that fundamentalist Christians are the most overweight population. And more recently, there are some studies suggesting that there have been some improvements in nutrition. A second problem is that there's information overload. Everywhere you look, somebody's telling you, eat this, don't eat this, eat this one, don't eat this. And so it's very confusing. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of advertising and marketing that's obviously biased. It's even debated what actually constitutes food. Society seems obsessed with food. There's a new fad diet every day. Like don't. But if you were to look at the, browse the magazines, and you go to the grocery store, and do stay away from social media, obviously. And Christians are not immune to this either. And in Christian terms, this would be termed idolatry, being overly focused on food. Eating is also emotional and social, even tied to our identity. And there can be both positive and negative implications to this. Stress eating is very common. If we're honest, we've probably all engaged in something like that. Lots of cliches about eating, that do you eat to live, or do you live to eat? You are what you eat. People can be very passionate about their food choices. And again, I'm sure you've all got friends and neighbors that you can think of. But it's not just about what we eat, it's also about when, how, and with whom. Food is intertwined with health factors. There are multiple economic, political, social factors. Globally, there's food inequalities and inadequacy, and food choices impact the environment. So obviously we can't cover everything today, but we're going to briefly consider biblical, theological aspects, perspectives of food, eating, and then we're going to examine some contemporary scientific evidence on nutrition, particularly the focus on plant-based nutrition. And hopefully this will help navigate some of the confusing information. So to begin with, so first of all, I'm sure you all know the Bible is not a medical textbook. And a brief summary of wise interpretation: consider the original language of the Bible, consider the authorial intent, consider biblical context, both its immediate context and its broader context. In other words, never make conclusions based just on one biblical verse. Remember the context of the ancient culture. It's very difficult to compare eating habits in biblical times versus our contemporary world. Food availability was different. There's studies showing that nutritional content of the same food is different. Some archaeological studies actually suggest that the ancient Middle East diet was somewhat nutritionally deficient. So let's start with reviewing some maybe theologically unwise strategies. Many of you have heard of the so-called Daniel diet, popularized in many Christian circles, or the Daniel fast, based on the story in Daniel chapter 1, where the king chose handsome young men from Judah to train for service. And Daniel and put them on a diet of, chose them. But Daniel asked not to defile himself with the king's food and wine and suggested only eat vegetables for 10 days. And at the end of that time, Daniel and his friends were healthy and the others. Wonderful. We should all do this. However, have you ever heard of a John the Baptist diet? A biblical, nutritious. So critique from a scientifitic perspective, it's been argued, well, this is a prototype of a clinical trial, but we don't have information about the control group, what was in the royal rations. We don't have information about the quantity or the quality of the vegetables. We don't have information about the protein, the legumes eaten. We don't have information about other factors like exercise, prayer. We could ask if 10 days sufficient for a clinical trial. Then we can critique it from a biblical perspective. So the immediate context is the people of God in exile in a foreign land. So looking for identity as the people of God. The story is about Daniel's obedience and God's sovereignty. The king's food was likely rich. In fact, the biblical term refers more to delicacies, also possibly unclean, including pork, for example. Could possibly have been sacrificed to idols. Accepting food from the king meant accepting friendship, so the social factors as well. So in sum, this is not a pro-vegan diet, but it's a demonstration of God's sovereignty and the importance of obedience followed by blessing. When we look at the broader context, there are multiple other verses stating that eating meat is quite acceptable. Remember the post-flood covenant with Noah in Genesis 9? Eat everything that lives and moves will be food. Deuteronomy 12, you may eat as much meat as you want. We know the stories of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. God gave them manna and quail, bread and meat, no vegetables. What do we make of that? So again, it's not about the food so much as it is about God's provision. We also have Peter's vision in Acts 10, where he's told it's okay to kill and eat all sorts of creatures, including unclean ones. So the point is that a new order is replacing the priestly laws, and that God makes all things clean. Paul also teaches whoever eats meat does so to the Lord. Whoever abstains so does so to the Lord. So Bible is not a cookbook. There are some other common misinterpretations from there. So fasting commonly, it's in the Bible, but and it's been shown to be healthy, but the point in the Bible is that it's for prayer, drawing close to God, not for health. You may have heard of Ezekiel bread based on Ezekiel 4. It's certainly healthy, no doubt. But if you look at the passage, the ingredients are listed, but there's no information about how to prepare it, how to process it, etc. I'm reminded of, so a lot of this relates to the confusing clean, unclean Levitical laws about what's clean, what's unclean. And commonly people have thought, that's called the hygiene hypothesis, that God knew what was healthy or what wasn't, and they eat this. But I was like a quote from Mary Douglas, an anthropologist who did pioneering work in understanding the Levitical laws. And she states that Moses was a great spiritual leader, not an enlightened public health administrator. So I think we need to take a big picture approach, starting at the beginning. I'm sure all Redeemer students are familiar with this worldview strategy. God made all things, if all things are good. In Genesis 1, he creates the plants and gives them to humans as food. This, by the way, is sometimes also used to say, well, no, the Bible proves a vegetarian diet, but remember all the other verses we just discussed. We're made in God's image, which means we are beings of high value. Therefore, we are worth taking care of. And as embodied beings, this includes nutrition. God also commands us to care for his creation. Well-known creation mandate, have dominion over in Genesis 2, to kill and keep the earth. There's much conversation on creation care and the environment, which is excellent. But part of the creation mandate, having dominion over all created things, includes ourselves, and that's sometimes neglected. Jesus teaches love of self along with love of God and neighbor. And this includes responsible stewardship. Jesus taught and modeled nourishment and rest. In the feeding of the 5,000, he says that the disciples did not even have a chance to eat. And he said, come with me by yourself to a quiet place, get some rest. Overall, a lot of overall verses suggesting that it's important to honor and care for our bodies. We're also told to avoid overindulgence. Proverbs 23 is quite harsh. Put a knife to your throat if you're given to gluttony. Ecclesiastes 10 cautions against drunkenness. And drunkenness is often listed in the so-called vice list in the epistle. It also involves caring for our neighbors. Feeding the hungry is a priority. And those who do so are rewarded. Isaiah 58 talks about it. Jesus teaches about care for the poor, and the early church modeled sharing possessions and food. That's for the no needy person. So food and meals are frequently mentioned in the Bible. Majority of time, though, used actually in a metaphorical manner. Briefly, a typical diet was likely primarily plant-based because meat was expensive and for the elite. So the so-called Mediterranean triad talks about grain, wine, and olive oil, but there would have been some meat, some fish, some fruit. There's a lot of mention of fig cake. There also wasn't really preservation available. Famine was common, lots of stories about that. Generally, food is somewhat meaning-laden, and I think that's still the case today, as we mentioned earlier. Strongly associated with community and culture, offering a meal was considered standard hospitality in those times. Food was a common gift. Eating was very social. Women prepared the food, which was a chance for them to chat with their neighbors. Multiple stories of food as a blessing and a celebration. Wedding feasts, festivals, etc. Jesus shared a meal with his disciples after his resurrection. The church in Acts often shared a meal. Some teaching about meat relates to considering your neighbor. So Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians that what I eat, if it causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will not eat meat again. Very much a spiritual component as well. Think of the bread of the presence in the tabernacle. Israel was told to keep separate from their pagan neighbors in terms of what they ate. Jesus is the bread of life. His flesh is true food, teaches us to give thanks. And Paul also teaches to avoid food sacrificed to idols. Food is very symbolic, often used in parables and other metaphorical manners. A lot of banquet imagery. In ancient Israel, could be said that all feasting and fasting implied an intersection between divine and human spheres. Symbolic of divine provision and blessing. We talked about the Israelites being given manna and quail and given just enough, perhaps echoed in the Lord's Prayer. Give us the food we need for today. God commanded ravens to feed Elijah. Interestingly, this was in contrast to other ancient Near Eastern religions where the purpose of humans was to actually feed the God. In contrast, the God of Israel feeds humans. Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes to feed his followers, provides his disciples with a miraculous catch of fish. The importance of dependence and trust in God is emphasized. So food as usually sacrifice related to tithing cultivates and reminds us of our dependence on God. There's a warning not to forget God in times of prosperity. Jesus teaches, do not worry about what you're going to eat. Food is often a means of participating in worship, celebrating God's goodness in the feast. Sometimes it was also associated with times of fasting, rest from work, and usually included provisions for the poor. And we remember Jesus' sacrifice through the Eucharist. And to balance provision and abundance, the Bible also teaches about abstaining from food for times of mourning and for times of prayer. However, as we all know, humans do not always obey God. And in fact, the first sin recorded involves food. So the good created order can be inverted. Food that is given to us for good can be used in harmful, self-centered ways. Many cautions throughout the Bible against idolatry, gluttony, drunkenness. Prophets associated overindulgence with the wicked and the sinful, whom Jeremiah describes as fat and sick. Paul harshly critiques the inequalities in the Corinthian church, where some overindulge and some go hungry. So to conclude this section, we need to balance between food and feast, bountiful blessing, being faithful, enjoying the abundance God has provided, but also being mindful of neighbors who suffer from hunger as a result of unequal distribution of this abundance. The Bible is very informative about our attitude to food and nutrition, but it is not interested in offering specific advice about specific dietary plans. And that's where science comes in, an activity that's part of the creation mandate. And I'll turn it over at this point to Dr. Ganguli.
Thanks very much. So moving on to the scientific perspective, this is kind of the hierarchy of medical studies and in terms of how good the evidence that they provide for us is. If you note halfway up, there's something called a cohort study. A cohort study is where you take a group of people and you follow them forward in time and you measure their dietary intake and their diseases. There's something called a randomized controlled trial, which is the red thing even on top of that. A randomized controlled trial is where you take a group of individuals, you split them into two groups, and you give your experimental intervention to one group and the control intervention to the other group. And you divide these groups randomly, and then you follow them forward in time. And that's truly the best way to tell if an intervention you have is actually making a difference. And then something called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is actually, they come up with a way to statistically summarize the results of multiple studies. So basically to combine all of the studies together to get a better estimate of things. These are the three best ways in medical science that we understand causation, we understand how to change diseases, and that's the level of evidence that I am going to be concentrating on during this talk. This isn't a real big group, so if I say something on a slide, or there's something on a slide you don't understand, feel free to stick up your hand and I can clarify. Other questions perhaps we can leave till the end, because I'm just not sure about the backgrounds of everyone in this audience, but there we go. So the Daniel diet itself has actually been the subject of some fairly recent scientific studies. So for example, here's a group where they actually did a study where they kind of made two publications out of it, but they wanted to see if the Daniel diet, as they interpreted it from the Bible, affected metabolic and cardiovascular disease risk factors. So they took 43 people, men and women, they put them on this, quote, Daniel diet for 21 days. So their definition or their interpretation of the Daniel diet was free of animal products, free of preservatives, free of white flour, flavorings, alcohol, caffeine. So it was really quite a strict diet. It was even beyond what we might call a vegan diet because they avoided those things. So basically fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, which is beans, lentils, tofus, and seeds. And so basically they got these people to maintain dietary records. So the 7 days before they started the study, that was the baseline. And then the last 7 days of the 21 days they were on the diet, Daniel diet. So they looked at their dietary records to compare it. And then they measured all sorts of outcomes of these people basically after 21 days on this Daniel diet. So what did they find? Well, first of all, they found statistically significant drops in blood pressure, statistically significant drops in lipids. That's total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and HDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is the most relevant for heart disease, so that is clinically significant. Then they also looked at total antioxidant capacity, and antioxidants are a class of chemicals that tend to fight disease. That was increased, so that was good. They also looked at total nitrates. Nitric oxide is actually a chemical that mediates the dilation of blood vessels inside your body. So they looked at total nitrates as a marker or a surrogate of that, and those also went up, which is a good sign. So basically it means you're less likely to get a heart attack because the vessels in your heart can dilate. So all of those improved in a statistically significant and probably clinically significant way. They also looked at some other things that moved in the right direction but didn't quite reach statistical significance. One is insulin levels. Generally, you want low insulin levels because when you overeat, you need more insulin, you burn out your pancreas, you get diabetic. So that was lower. Then there's something called insulin resistance, which is actually a blockage to the ability of insulin to work, usually because we're overweight. That also improved. And then there's something called C-reactive protein. That's a sensitive marker of inflammation. Inflammation tends to lead to blood clots, so generally the lower the better. So that also improved, but those didn't reach statistical significance, but there was a move in the right direction. So basically it looked quite positive. This begs the question, is there a consensus on what constitutes a healthy diet? And this is literally like stepping out into the middle of a war zone, to be honest. But there is a recent publication where they looked at 78 papers published between 2010 and 2021 that gave food recommendations on either general health or diseases like heart disease or diabetes. And they just tried to kind of collate what the consensus of these 78 publications were. And so I've split this into two slides. Green means they recommended increased intake. Red means on the left means they recommended decreased intake. So for example, you can see that 74% of the studies recommended increased vegetable intake, 0% recommended decrease. So here you can see there are pretty strong recommendations to increase fruit, whole grains, legumes, nuts. And then you're getting down to about the 40% level about low-fat dairy, fish, seafood. 25% suggest more lean meat. 23% suggest more oily or fatty fish. And then as you can see, there's about 15% for skinless poultry or any poultry. So that's kind of the things that were recommended more of. Now, the things that are recommended less of, basically kind of neutral on eggs or any meat or salted nuts, but then same kind of neutral on dairy and full fat dairy. But then when you get to fatty meat, there's about a 12% kind of recommendations against that. Refined grains like white bread, white flour, 20% recommendations against. Processed meat, 27% recommendations against, and red meat, about 32% recommendations in meat. And to be honest, as an aside, often, let's just say there are huge influences on the people making these recommendations. But anyway, there you go. Leave it at that. Important safety information if you decide to make changes to your lifestyle. A whole food plant-based diet can actually reverse medical conditions like your high blood pressure or your diabetes. So if you're on medications for diabetes or your heart or blood pressure, these medications might actually have to be reduced because you have less disease. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, it's essential that people who go on a plant-based diet supplement with vitamin B12, 2 milligrams a week. It is essential for the normal function of nerves. It is also essential to have a healthy pregnancy. This is important. If you decide to go plant-based, you have to take B12. No ifs, ands, or buts. That happens to be my website, foodisprevention.com. I've got a whole section on supplements. Yeah.
Just in terms of, sorry to cut down.
Yeah.
But in terms of plant-based, like I know that there's like different like definitions of it in terms of like, you know, like plant-based being like mostly consuming plants with like a couple portions of meats, or like plant-based meaning entirely plant-based. So in this context with the supplement with vitamin B12, like what kind of
all animal products will give you some B12.
Okay.
But if you are only having animal products like 2 or 3 times a week, it probably doesn't hurt to either take a daily multivitamin or the B12.
Okay.
Great question. Yeah. And actually, once people hit 50, B12 deficiency becomes actually not uncommon at all. So once again, essentially all multivitamins have a bit of B12. It probably doesn't hurt to take a multivitamin once you're over 50. Yeah, great question. Okay, let your family doctor know if you're making changes in your diet. Okay, beautiful. So let's look at some studies. So actually what got me all into this is that I was on the edge of diabetes and I was desperate not to become diabetic. So I started looking for studies to prevent diabetes. This is the biggest study ever done of preventing diabetes. They took 3,200 people who were pre-diabetic and they randomized them basically to a placebo intervention or a lifestyle intervention. The lifestyle intervention was nothing to do with a plant-based diet. The lifestyle intervention was a low-fat, heart-healthy diet, which is the diet that everyone is supposed to be on. So this was an omnivore diet, but there was lots of exercise prescribed as well. The goal was to get these people to lose 7% of their body weight. So they had small groups, they had dietitians, they had exercise physiologists. They literally hounded these people to be exercising and to be on a heart-healthy omnivore diet. And sure enough, 4 years later, the people who were in that lifestyle group had about a 20% risk of developing diabetes, where the ones in the placebo group had about a 36% risk of developing diabetes. So there was a difference, and that was statistically significant. Now, in clinical studies, we have a way to flip this into something what we, as physicians, we're not incredibly smart. So we have something called a number needed to treat. How many people would have to do this to prevent one case of diabetes? So basically, you take the reciprocal of the absolute risk difference between them. So if you do 36% minus 20% is 16%, you take the reciprocal. It basically means for every 7 people who did this intervention, you would prevent 1 case of diabetes, just to kind of give you a feel for how much of it. Most people find that a nicer number to crunch. Okay. So I thought that sounded kind of good. I had hope at that point. But the interesting thing in this study is they followed their people for 15 years. And this looks at the rate of developing diabetes at 15 years. And if you look on the right-hand side, the lifestyle group, the red bar is their rate of developing diabetes, which is 52%. So in other words, more than half of the people still developed diabetes. And this study, the intensity of this intervention with the small groups and the dietitians, the exercise physiologists, there is no way on heaven or earth you can recreate this in the normal world because you don't have millions of dollars, because that's exactly what this study took. So for me, this was a total downer. Basically, there was a more than 50% chance I would be diabetic in 15 years' time. Depressing. So I kept looking at different studies. Then I came across a very interesting study. HbA1c on the vertical scale, that's a totally cool blood test. It basically averages your blood sugar for the last 8 weeks. It's as though you checked your blood sugar every day for 8 weeks and you did an average. So it's an incredibly accurate way to diagnose diabetes and to follow diabetes. So Neil Barnard took 99 people who already had the type 2 diabetes. Half of them he put on the American Diabetes Association diet, which is basically the same low-fat, heart-healthy, omnivore diet as in the last study. For the other half, he had them do something called whole foods, minimally processed, plant-based. He followed them for 74 weeks, which is a year and a half. So 99 people, good number of people who have diabetes for 74 weeks, year and a half, good length of time. And those curves are the HbA1c curves. Time is on the horizontal axis. As you can see, after about 3 months, the A1C curves separate and they stay separate. In other words, there's no comparison. This whole food plant-based diet whipped the pants off the American Diabetes Association diet, which is the one recommended by the American Diabetes Association. Why don't they recommend the more effective diet? I won't go there. Okay, so that's diabetes, diet studies, and heart disease. Dean Ornish, back in the 1990s, took people who had angina, chest pain related to narrow heart vessels, and he knew it because he did something called an angiogram. He took 48 of them and he randomized them into do what your doctor tells you, which is not very much, or this is not just diet, it's a comprehensive lifestyle intervention. Quit smoking, meditation, relaxation, some gentle exercise, several hours of small group support per week, and essentially a vegan diet. In his initial study, I think he allowed low-fat dairy. And he did angiograms to look at how narrow the blood vessels were at the start, 1 year later, and 5 years later. This graph is how narrow the blood vessels are. So diameter stenosis is narrowing. So it's how narrow are the blood vessels. In the control group, you can see that they go from 41% narrowing up to 52% narrowing. So their blood vessels got more narrow over the next 5 years. The group that did the lifestyle intervention, you can see their blood vessel narrowing went from about 40% down to 37%. In other words, the blood vessels became less narrow. In other words, there was reversing of the narrowing of blood vessels. This is the #1 cause of death in the USA, and he was able to reverse it. He also showed, which was very interesting, because not everyone did everything they were supposed to. He showed that the more compliant a person was, the greater the difference in the diameter of their blood vessels. So there's what we call a dose response curve, which once again shows that it's causal. And this was a randomized study. Okay. A different study was done in New Zealand, a family doctor's practice. They took 65 overweight subjects who were at risk of heart disease because they had elevated cholesterol or they had diabetes, and they randomized them into either normal diet or a whole food plant-based diet. They followed these people for 6 months. And 6 months later, the group that was randomized to the whole food plant-based diet lost on average more than 10 kilograms. So that's over 22 pounds. That is the greatest weight loss ever published in the medical literature in a randomized study where people were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. That's how effective this diet can be. There's a significant risk decrease in BMI, because it's another way of measuring weight. Their HbA1c, the measure of diabetes, also went down. Their blood pressure didn't change, but they really had a very positive outcome. So it works in the real world, because this was a rural New Zealand study. Okay, let's look at cancer, which is a tougher one. So this is what's called a cohort study. There's this huge group of nurses and male healthcare professionals in the USA that have been followed. To get into the study, they looked at 37,000 male healthcare professionals, 83,000 nurses. They followed them for about 22 years, and there's tons of publications have come out of this group. To get into the study, they have to be free of heart disease and free of cancer at the beginning. Every 4 years, they send them 200 questions about their diseases, their diet, what they're up to. They followed them, actually, they've now followed them out for almost 30 years, and then they adjust. There's a fancy statistical way that you can try and adjust for differences in lifestyle factors and risk factors. So here's a list of the things that they adjusted for. So they adjusted for people's calorie intakes, their fruit and vegetable intake, their whole age grain intake, their age, their weight, their race, their smoking, how much alcohol they took, how much exercise they took, whether they took a multivitamin, whether they took aspirin, whether they had a family history of diabetes, heart attack, cancer, whether the person had diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and then menopausal. So they tried to adjust for everything they could to see the effect of diet on various outcomes. So here is the effect on total mortality. So what they did is they took meat intake of these people, they divided into quintiles. Quintiles is 20%. Lowest 20% of meat intake versus the highest 20% of meat intake. So here you can see for men that quintile 5, which is the red bar, is they had a 37% higher total mortality. How much meat was that a day, you ask? That's the little box at the bottom. It's 2 portions of meat a day. A portion of meat is about the size of a pack of playing cards. It's about 4 ounces. So people in the top 20%, men 37% increased mortality, women 24% increased mortality. But what about other outcomes? Well, let's look at cancer mortality. Same general trend. Men 24% increased mortality from cancer, women 17% if you're in the top quintile. Then let's look at the effect of just increasing your intake by 1 portion of meat a day. But note, it's a little different here. Now we're looking at total meat versus unprocessed meat versus processed meat. So here, for example, you can see that total mortality increases by 12% for 1 portion of total meat intake, but it increases by 20% if that meat is processed. Processed means bacon, wieners, anything that you get in a place which has golden arches. You know, so hopefully you can see that there's a difference between unprocessed meat in blue and processed meat in red. Cardiovascular, it's 18% versus 21%. That's not a big difference, but it's both increased for 1 portion a day. Cancer, it's 10% versus 16% increase in cancer mortality for 1 portion a day. So this is getting a little depressing for me. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of data that plant-based diets decrease the risk of cancer. And with that as a background, I came across what I thought was a totally cool study where they basically tried to see if different vegetables had specific effects on inhibiting cancer. So what they did now was basically a test tube study, because you can grow cancer cells in a test tube. So what they did is they took 34 different vegetables, they stuck them in a juicer, they filtered the juice, and they literally dripped vegetable juice on cancer cells in test tubes. So they had 8 different sets of cancer cells, and they had 34 different vegetables that they dripped the juice on the cancer cells. Which cancers? Stomach, breast, pancreas, prostate, lung, 2 brain cancers, and a kidney cancer. So these are all fairly common cancers, although the most common would be breast and pancreas, for what it's worth. And sorry, breast and prostate. All right. So this is these are the results slides. 100% up here, 100% means no change. 75% means that the rate of the cell division, the rate of cancer cell division was 25% lower. And here you can see the names of the different vegetables. So what you can see is this huge difference. So here, for example, if we go down to the bottom, I put a little kind of a red kind of boxy around the bottom. Yellow onion, kale, radish, broccoli, curly cabbage. All of those vegetables slow the rate of cell division of breast cancer by more than 90%. Like, I found that mind-boggling, you know, but at least in this study, carrots, tomatoes, fennel, romaine lettuce didn't make a big difference. So that's breast cancer. And then here are the numbers for prostate cancer. Once again, at the bottom are the heavy hitters. Curly cabbage, red, yellow onion, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, leek, green onion, Brussels sprouts, garlic. These things slow the rate of cancer cell division by over 9%. There were similar trends with all the other cancers. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you a summary slide. So on the right-hand side, there are the ones that have very high activity, which means more than 50% inhibition of cell division on all the cancer cell lines. So who do you want to invite to your party? Brussels sprouts, cabbage, curly cabbage, garlic, green onion, kale, leek, spinach. These fall in, yeah.
If these are vegetables used to injure on cancer cells, could this not just say that they limit cell division in general?
Excellent point. And actually, oh boy, yeah, you're on the ball. So right at the bottom, it said normal dermal fibroblasts. So they put skin cells in to see if normal cells were inhibited by vegetables. Excellent question. And they weren't. Okay, if I had a gold star, you would have it. Well done. So yeah, they are not toxic to normal cells. It's a valid question. It's totally valid. So these, the good guys, the good vegetables fall into two families. One is called the cruciferous vegetables, and the other one is called allium vegetables. It's basically the garlic, onion, leek family. So cruciferous vegetables and the garlic, onion, leek family, in this study at least, had the greatest potency at inhibiting cancer. So actually we go to, yes.
Does it matter if it was raw or cooked?
Well, that's a great question. In this study, it was raw and it was spun and it was filtered. Now, the thing is once you cook something, you change the proteins, you denature the proteins, so it is possible that there is a loss of efficacy. It's a great question. Yeah. Not much time to talk about organic food, but in this study, they were looking at organic food intake and the risk of cancer. And basically, at the bottom, I said the model, these are all the things they adjusted for at the bottom. So they adjusted for a whole bunch of factors and to look and see if people who took organic food had a lower cancer risk. So here, the shorter the bar, it means the more potent it is at lowering the risk of cancer. A little red star means significant. So for example, organic food has about a 35% risk reduction in postmenopausal breast cancer here, which is significant. You see that? And then non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it's like an 80% reduction in risk. And for all lymphomas, it's actually about a 60% reduction in risk. This ties in with something called glyphosate. Glyphosate is the world's most widely used pesticide. And even our malignant oncologists actually agreed with me that it can cause cancer. They said it only causes cancer with huge exposures, such as people with farm workers. But anyway, and the really scary thing is that it's used in the harvesting of essentially all grains. They literally dump it on to kill everything so that they can harvest it quickly without having to wait for things to dry. The only reasonable way to avoid glyphosate in grains that I know of is by buying organic. Anyway, whatever. So there we go. And then what about ultra-processed foods? Well, here's an interesting study from France where they followed 104,000 people for 8 years, looking at their intake of ultra-processed foods for like 2,500 days and their risk of developing cancer. Quarter one is the bottom 25% of ultra-processed food. Quartile 4, the orange line, is the top 25% of ultra-processed foods. So you can see that even after 500 days, the lines seem to separate, and that the people who are in the highest intake of ultra-processed foods look like they have a higher rate of cancer. And we are literally seeing cancers like colon cancers, about 10 years younger than we did 25 years ago. And it looks like it's the ultra-processed foods. So this is not trivial at all. So you ask, how much fruit and veggies should I eat? Great question. So here we can look at meta-analyses and look at that. So this is a summary of 15 studies with 950,000 people in them, looking at death rates and vegetable intakes. So on the horizontal axis is how much vegetables a person takes in grams per day. And on the vertical axis is the relative risk of dying. So here you can see that basically, for example, at about 300 grams a day, you've got a 20% decreased risk of dying. And as you get up to 800 grams a day, you get up to, looks like about at least a 25% decreased risk of dying. So this gives you a feel for how much vegetables will cause how much decrease in mortality. What about heart disease? Here you can see that it's a straight line all the way up to 800 grams a day of vegetables. And it looks like you get at least a 20% decrease in mortality from heart disease. Cancers are a harder one. The timeline for cancer is unbelievably long. So that kind of plateaus at, looks to me like somewhere about 450 grams a day, a pound of vegetables a day, which it looks like roughly a 10% decrease in risk. So there you go. All right. They actually did country-specific data in this study. So they were somehow able to crunch the numbers and say, if the average Canadian had 500 grams a day of vegetables, we would avoid 9% of deaths from heart disease, 23% of deaths from strokes, 7% of deaths from total cancer, and 12% of all deaths. If we could get Canadians to eat 800 grams a day, we would drop heart disease deaths by 17% and all cancer mortality by about 17%, which is about 1 in 6 deaths. That's how much difference you can make by increasing your veggies. They are your friends. Then there's another cool study I came across where they tried to look at the average diet versus an optimal diet. This isn't even a vegan diet, but any movement in the right direction is movement in the right direction. So here it shows how many years of life you gain by making changes in your intake, for example, of whole grains. If you go from 50 grams of whole grains per day to 225 grams of whole grains per day, you'll gain about 2 years of life expectancy. If you drop your refined grains from 150 to 50 grams a day, you'll gain about a year. If you increase your veggies from 250 grams a day to 400 grams a day, you'll gain about 3 months. Fruits gain you about 4 months. Just taking an ounce of nuts a day can give you 1.5 to 2 years of life. So unsalted nuts in small quantities will extend your life. Legumes, which is beans, lentils, chickpeas, tofu, will give you 2 years of life. Increasing your fish will give you about 6 months. Decreasing your eggs will save you about 6 months. Sorry. Milk and dairy will save you a little bit. Eliminating red meat will save you 1.5 to 2 years. Eliminating just 50 grams of processed meat will save you 1.5 to almost 2 years. And cutting your sugar-sweetened beverage intake to 0 will save you about a year. So this gives you a feel, yeah.
Those out of 10, do you get 15 years if you do them all?
Well, whether you can't give you a money-back guarantee on it, but I dare you to try it. Most common question that comes up is, where do I get my protein? This is where you get your protein. Beans, lentils, legumes, tofu, tempeh, edamame, which are all legumes actually. Quinoa is the best grain for protein. When it comes to beans and lentils, you know a coffee mug? You have that much a day of beans, lentils, legumes, tofu, tempeh, you're laughing. World Health Organization says you only need 0.8 grams per day per kilogram of body weight. And even if you talk about digestibility and round it up to 1, you'll be fine. But that's the number one issue. And there's a portion is defined at the bottom of that screen. But beans, lentils, legumes are our friend. And culturally, depending on your cultural background, you may or may not take a lot. So in conclusion, a plant-based diet results in better control of type 2 diabetes, more weight loss, and a lower risk of diabetes in people at risk for heart disease. Red meat intake is associated with more total cancer, more cardiovascular mortality, and greater fruit and vegetable intake is associated with lower total death rate, lower cardiovascular death rate, and a lower rate of cancer. However, research is ongoing, and that will hopefully refine things as we learn more, and I will turn it over to my colleague.
So for final conclusion, so there is compelling evidence for adopting a plant-based diet. However, it's not going to fix all your problems. It's not a cure-all. And there's also, we should mention actually, we didn't have time to talk about all the other evidence for the benefits of a plant-based diet. This is not incompatible with biblical teaching, and it is a way to enact responsible stewardship over God's creation. And a plant-based diet has implications for other aspects of creation care, especially the environment, I'm sure you're aware of. Make sure we get things in perspective broadly. Remember, there's multiple other aspects to self-care and disease prevention. So including exercise, rest, mindful eating, avoiding toxic social interaction, healthy spiritual life, all those things are important. Remember, the Bible teaches wisdom, and wisdom can include wise research and practice and learning. Also teaches love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. The Bible does not teach nutritional science. We cannot rely on biblical texts that are not meant to provide healthcare advice in the 21st century. The Daniel diet is an interesting and meaningful parallel that is likely coincidental, and it's okay to use it as an illustration, but not to say that the Bible is teaching science. Then other meaningful coincidences in the Bible are fasting, which has been shown to have health benefits as well, but the biblical teaching about fasting is about drawing close to God. Saying grace before meal, mindful eating has been shown to be beneficial, but grace is about gratitude and our Creator. As always, we need to be guided by the Spirit as we endeavor to image God and faithfully and to fulfill the creation mandate. And we both spoke fairly quickly to give lots of time for questions and some results.
Yeah, I think that was a great combination. Thank you for partnering up on this. That was wonderful.
I have a question. I don't know your name. You said that you were diagnosed with pre-diabetes.
Yeah.
So my question is, what changes did you make, and what did you find was positive, and what was hard about that?
Yeah, so basically I was dragged kicking and screaming into this whole food plant-based diet. I lost 20 pounds and I'm not pre-diabetic. So there you go. Yeah, so it worked for me.
So can you talk a little bit about what that transition was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it took several years. Like my daily, what I used to have is I used to have like something like a whole bran breakfast cereal. I used to have a sandwich, to be honest, brown bread, often with ham and veggies and a Diet Coke for lunch. And suppers were just whatever, spaghetti bolognese and chicken and this and that. So now, and actually my website, which is the fourth down, foodsprevention.com, has tons of recipes and stuff. It has my recommended breakfast, which is steel-cut oats, chia, flaxseed, and frozen blueberries. So that's what I have for breakfast. Lunch is basically a salad with beans, lentils, or legumes in it. And suppers are basically combinations of, veggie stir fries, or it's kind of almost unlimited things, and then minimizing the processed foods as well. Yeah, but I also did exercise and other things also. Yeah.
I can speak to that too. I also practice what I preach, I should mention. So for me, the journey was a bit more gradual. I had stopped red meat mostly because of environmental concerns and had increased my, maybe eating plant-based twice a week. But I was developing high cholesterol. And so that was my motivation to be more rigid. And it's fun. The irony is that I thought I was pretty healthy. I mean, I got my 7 servings, the Canadian guideline, the 7 servings of vegetables a day. I exercise, but it really is quite a radical difference. And it's challenging. I will admit that. It's a learning curve for sure. Travel is very difficult. Church potlucks, family gatherings. So I do eat chicken on occasion just because of availability or lack of availability. With exercise, I do find sometimes getting just the quantities of protein. I found it initially difficult, and I'd never had this in my life before, but actually eating enough to stop losing weight. So with the cholesterol, I'd also gone with a very high fiber and ultra low fat. And then you can get some skin changes. And so, there's real, it is a learning curve for sure. And that's why we give you some resources. But I think the key is to start slowly. So if I think it was Dr. Oz who did the 1 thing per day, but certainly having seen that, but it's difficult to make all of the changes all at once. So take what's going to work for you, and take what's going to be a little bit on the easier side, and then it's a process. But there's benefits to even making those small changes.
So I actually have my own story about this. So when I was 14, I broke out in chronic hives every day for like 9 months of my life. At one point, I went into anaphylaxis and my throat closed, and they could not figure out what was going on with me. So eventually, my doctor was just putting me on steroids, and they just didn't really know what was going on. I developed a tolerance to antihistamine, so I was not even able. Nothing was helping me. So actually, I went to a naturopath, and because I was like looking for hope, and they actually recommended I go on a plant-based diet. So I actually went vegan for 2 years, and I completely got rid of my condition fully. And then I reverted back to eating meat and dairy, and I no longer have had to deal with that anymore just because I changed my diet. But my doctor never even thought to recommend that for me. So I just wonder, well, as physicians, like, do you ever recommend to patients about a plant-based diet? I know they probably don't want to listen, but that's the problem.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
some people don't even realize it's an option. Like, I even work at a pharmacy, and I've had my pharmacist recommend diet and completely reverse people's pre-diabetes and everything. So like, my doctor never even told me that.
Yeah.
And
So
actually,
in new information, we were talking before the talk about how it took about 50 years or more and thousands of studies before people became aware that smoking causes cancer. So there is a process of information diffusing into general society, including physicians. But I would say there's more and more awareness. But yeah, and you do have to take time to educate, because a lot of people, oh, just give me a pill, and they don't want to do, to take the work. So yeah, it is difficult, but yeah, we all.
Thanks for sharing that, Sue.
Yeah, we'll go here and then, yeah, go ahead. Okay, talking about fruits and vegetables. What is the good side and the reduced side of fresh versus cooked?
The more vegetables, the better. And so any differences are incredibly minor, but basically proteins get denatured with cooking. So there are things called phytonutrients, which they literally make us healthier. And so those might be slightly damaged by cooking, but like I say, whatever form it takes to get it in. And I mean, in practice, I think a mixture of cooked and uncooked is reasonable, So I wouldn't, that's a very, very minor thing, but it's good to have some raw vegetables. Like, for example, vitamin C and other things go down with cooking quite a bit. Yeah. And, you didn't ask the best way of cooking. Boiling and steaming are probably the best ways of cooking almost everything. Because when you do the high temperature or the barbecuing, you get a whole bunch of things like acrylamides and this and that, and all of these nasty chemicals when we burn stuff. Unfortunately, it's really frustrating because often the things that make things like caramelization is something called a Maynard reaction. It tastes great, but it turns it not so good for your body. So yeah, boiling and steaming can help this.
Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, last question. Interesting talk. I just wonder, every data here, like incidence of the diabetes, incidence of the cancer, is age adjustment already or not? Because for example, in this country, the distribution of the old people may be totally different. So
Absolutely.
they already consider this kind of data, especially if we want to compare 50 years ago or 5 years ago, maybe the population age distribution is already changed.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you were here at the beginning of the talk, but that is one of the first adjustments they make is age, body mass index, energy intake, smoking. But yes, absolutely. Age is obviously going to drive these concepts. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, feel free to take a picture of the resources if you want. Those are pretty decent resources all over. The Forks Over Knives documentary is astounding. It's free, and you'll see what happens to people who have diabetes when they switch to a plant-based diet. They go from 8 drugs to 6 drugs to 4 drugs to 2 drugs to 1 drug.
Okay, I know people have to get going for lunch, but let's thank Jen and Subhas for the talk.